thank you for being here. I'd like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. I'd also like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today because it's through your support that we're able to have free events like Mornings with O'Keeffe. If you're not yet a member and you like this program and want to learn more about the other benefits that membership can get you, please consider joining. And you can learn more about that at gokm.org/membership to learn more. Throughout this talk, please place your questions in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the conversation. For the duration of the lecture, the chat has been disabled. Please note that following today's talk, a recording will be made available on the O'Keeffe Museum's website in a week or two once captions in English and Spanish have been added to the video. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenters this morning. Today we are joined by Francisco Uviña-Contreras, who is the assistant professor at the University of New Mexico's School of Architecture and Planning. And we are also joined by Giustina Renzoni, who is the director of the historic properties at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. And together they're going to take us on a lovely tour of the history of global use of adobe and the contextual history that surrounds that wonderful architectural material, which will be shared with us by Francisco. And then Francisco will then hand things off to Giustina, who will explore how that history connects to the historic properties in Abiquiu that belong to Georgia O'Keeffe. So without any further delay, I will go ahead and turn things over to our speakers, and thank you both so much for being here.
Hello, everybody. Let me share my presentation here. So give me 1 second. Can everybody see that? Can you see it?
Looks great.
Okay, perfect. So, so we'll get started. So as Molly mentioned, she presented us, Justina, which will be presenting after me. So my name is Francisco Uviña-Contreras. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of New Mexico. So what I'm going to be presenting today, hopefully in 15 minutes, I will try to do that, is a brief history of world earthen architecture history. And then eventually ending up in New Mexico. Oh, it's not going forward. Give me 1 second here. I don't know what's happening. Oh, there you go. So let me see. Okay. So the first slide, it's basically just really quickly, it's just letting you know, and there's missing pieces in this map or in this world map on the use of earthen architecture. I'm going to call it earthen architecture because there's different typologies when it comes to the use or utilization of earth as an architecture or housing construction. So this is the world. As you can see, New Mexico is somewhat in there, but it should be quite more, as Brazil as well, Argentina, and many parts of Africa, as you can see there. So I'll begin with the wattle and daub. Wattle and daub is what we actually might call bajareque, quincha. In New Mexico, archaeologists have also called it jacal, and jacal is a very modest hut. That is a Spanish word for that particular building type. In Abiquiu, it's one of the early uses of before even adobe, where they basically would point a or create a log with a point, drive it into the ground with a wedge on top. They would actually put a bomb beam or a sill plate on top, which is a round plate. And then on top of that, the beams or the vigas. You'll hear me say vigas for quite a while. And this topology is quite utilized here in New Mexico in the early parts, also in the ancestral Puebloan regions as well. And my good colleague, Wilfredo Carazas, who is actually mud plastering a panel of woven reeds or caña brava, or which is like a light bamboo. And then we get to the puddled earth, which is one of the early technologies in this region, especially in the ancestral Puebloans, or the more recent Pueblo people. They did not quite use the adobe or the masonry unit. They were part of a movement that eventually was colonized in this region, and the colonizers bringing up Mesoamerican indigenous peoples such as the Tlaxcalan people, that they actually introduced the form in order to now mold the adobe. The other one that you saw, the puddled earth, you might also see it as puddled adobe. I don't like to call it puddled adobe because it is adobe to me. It's a masonry unit. It's not the mix. So archaeologists tend to do this quite a lot. And this is another technology that you also find in New Mexico in the Middle Rio Grande region, uh, big bodies of water. Back in the day, this is more of an American tradition brought over when they invaded the territory. So the terron is basically a sod block. That's what it is. And back in the day when the Rio Grande used to flood, they used to go out to the river edges and basically cut the blocks. Very similar in size to the adobes specifications of that time period, usually 4 by 8 by 16s plus or minus. And this technology basically died off soon after the rivers were controlled in the 1920s. So then we get to the adobe or the mud brick, which is perhaps the number one technology around the world when it comes to building. Really quickly, this is a picture of Wilfredo Carazas, a good colleague of mine in Peru, and then we have a young gentleman in Mali creating a block where we actually were visiting. So the adobe is a really simple method. It's basically a composition of clay, silts, sands, and binders, if you actually do have any types of binders. It's not all clay. And so there's a smaller proportion of clay. It's the cementitious material that clumps up all the sands and the silts together. And if you have too much clay, and slowly add binder to it, which could be straw, could be local grasses. So one of the things that I just wanted to talk briefly about is the Middle East and where the word adobe comes from. Although the New World, or the Americas already had the technology. So the technology does not come, through Europe to the New World or to the Americas. So the largest zones where this technology was being utilized and throughout China, the Middle East, and of course Northern Africa, it was the word really comes from the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were the ones that really and I don't know if it actually originated here specifically, but the word did. So the word was thobe in Egypt. So it's also mentioned in the Bible as well, in Exodus, where the Pharaoh, is letting the slaves people not to give him any straw, and they still need to produce the same amount of bricks. And what he's referring to is basically the mud brick for construction. And here we can actually see a Queen Hatshepsut, and she's forming an adobe or a mud brick, as you can see. So when the Arabs or Moors really started to take over this whole region of northern Africa into Egypt, and then eventually ended up in what we now consider or say it's Spain and Portugal, in those regions, they started to really introduce the word, changed it from thobe to atob, and this atob eventually ends up in Spain, what we now call Spain. So these are just examples of mud brick construction. This here on the left-hand side is in Timbuktu. It's the oldest mosque in Timbuktu, or actually in Africa, that's actually constructed out of earth. And the one on the right-hand side, it's the Djenné, and that's the largest adobe mosque in the world. So I will continue. So now we get to the Americas and the New World. Just to give you a brief understanding of how the adobe was already being manufactured in this part of the world. Uh, they had their own words, of course. They were speaking Nahuatl, and but also in Peru as well, that the mud brick was vastly produced and actually used for large constructions. In Mexico, as you can see here, they were used in pre-Columbian sites. This one is in Tizatlan. And so from that point, once the Europeans arrive onto the coast of Mexico and conquer the Mexicas, or what we now know as the Aztecs, as well, they basically borrowed that technology. There's sayings from Fray Saun saying the naturals, that's what they were called. The naturals know how to make adobe or mud brick. They know how to produce lime, and they know how to work with stone. So most of the pyramids in Mexico, the ones that you might see, such as Cholula, they all have an internal structure composed of all mud brick, very similar to Peru. So now we get to New Mexico. In New Mexico, we actually, the first initial signs of housing typologies are the pit houses. And the pit houses is an amazing technology that, give me 1 second, I'm trying to minimize this. Okay. So the pit house is basically an underground structure. And I tell my students, why is it underground? And so what they're actually doing here is they're going below the frost line. So that was a very inventive, really amazing thing to do. Remember that most of the civilizations in the past work with the nature, passive solar. They also work with regional materials. Whatever you had in hand, you would make the best out of it. So in this case, it was mud or dirt. That was and then plus, as you can see, the local wood as well when it comes to these pit houses, which is basically the evolution of the kiva, which is now the ceremonial center for many of the Puebloan cultures and indigenous peoples. From here, we start to see larger civilizations, such as a Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, which is right along the state line of Colorado and New Mexico. Uh, and then from there, we actually start to see the early uses of hand molded adobe or these mud bricks. Never really used a form. There's some signs that they might have maybe started to utilize a form, but it never really caught on to build mass housing. It was more of that puddled earth. A lot of archaeologists you'll hear calling it puddled adobe, which is incorrect to say. Remember, it's a masonry unit. Don't And then another thing, don't call it adobe block. It's like saying block. It's like saying Rio Grande River. Okay, so uh, please just keep it at adobe specifically. So the influence of the Arabs in Spain also influenced the language as well. So the language such as adobe, acequia, many terms that we use in this part of the world, in the Castilian language, we actually borrow from the Arabs or the Moors. So another technology that we also borrowed from them is the kiva, or the oven or horno that we call it. And this is like that little beehive oven that you see on the left-hand side. And this is Taos Pueblo. Once there was a drought, very severe drought in the 1300s, starting around 1250, they started to move away from these other settlements and establish new settlements. And they were always looking for water. But since there was hardly any stone, they basically modified their typologies of the architecture into more earth typologies or more earth architecture. Um, and when the Europeans arrive, or in this case, the Spanish and and Mexicans and mestizos and criollos and indigenous people, they basically started to borrow certain elements such as the horno, as you can see on the right-hand side. And then we actually then start to then connect, make that connection from Santa Fe, a little further up in what we used to call San Juan Pueblo, now Oquehuengue Pueblo, which was the first settlement of these early colonizers. And they eventually established what we call El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, this connection or connector from Mexico City through all the way up into Santa Fe was basically established also, seeking wealth, seeking gold, silver, especially in the cities of Durango, Zacatecas, Chihuahua, and all these. However, New Mexico did not have the wealth that they were looking for, but no Juan de Oñate still made the travel and got permission in 1598 from the Spanish crown. So this on the right-hand side is the Christianization taking place of these early indigenous communities. This is San Esteban del Rey in the Pueblo of Acoma. It's an amazing site. That used to be one of my projects. So please visit next time you're in New Mexico. So one of the words that I really wanted to, at least introduce to you, it's soquete. It's a common word used in northern Mexico and also in New Mexico quite a lot. A lot of people don't know where it actually comes from, but soquete is a Nahuatl word that we use here in this region, just like tecolote being owl and búho in Spanish. Soquete becomes important because we're borrowing from the Tlaxcalans, we're borrowing from the central Mesoamerican cultures. So soquete, there's two words. Soquete means mud in Nahuatl, but it can mean dam or blockhead, say in Spanish or in the Castilian language, which I believe is borrowed from the Arabics as well. So Soquitlan or Soquete, there's a town in central Mexico called Soquitlan, Mexico, and Soquitlan basically says its literal translation is the town built or made or constructed out of mud. So this is a word that is commonly used in New Mexico. So you'll, be aware. Then in the late or mid 1800s, the Americans invade the territory, took away the territory from Mexico since they wouldn't sell it to them. So they introduced new technologies and new ways of architecture and stylistic things that became almost very vernacular in New Mexico, like the one on the left-hand side. We now call it territorial style. They brought in neoclassical, neoclassical, neo-Gothic, and many other typologies, and also materials. Material became very essential and important when the railroad comes in the 1870s, early 1880s. So on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, you will see an early lime kiln, and this is in the town of Lamy. And Lamy is outside Santa Fe that actually has a track that goes into Santa Fe. So I'm pretty sure that this was actually used for the construction of the cathedral and the construction of the Loreto Chapel and many other things. Then we get to the 19 in the Depression, the New Deal Act. And in order to have people working at this time period, we started to create a social program such as WPA, Civil Corps of Engineers. But in New Mexico, what was really interesting is that people knew how to build with adobe, and it was a very demanding, time-consuming work. So many of the structures at that time period in New Mexico into the 1930s, early 1930s, were constructed out of the mud brick or adobe. Also because they knew how to make the adobe, build with it. So it was a very strong tradition in New Mexico. Then we get into the 1950s and 40s where we now start to mechanize the system. Before it was grandpa and grandma, making adobes with their family, stomping on the mud. Um, not anymore. Now we're basically mass producing these blocks. As you can see, they try to use as many different types of mechanized systems in order to create the mud, in order to pour it into the forms, and then basically just pull it up as soon as it was done. But soon after that, a lot of experimentation was taking place. Also, the other thing that was taking place is the standardizing of the adobe. So from a 12 by 24, as you can imagine, huge, large, very heavy adobes. These masonry units used to weigh probably about 50 pounds. So now we're now standardizing it at 4 by 10 by 14. And these are, if you go out and buy it, that's what you will be buying from these large manufacturing plants. The other thing that was actually put into them during experimentation with lime, Portland cement, but the one that was, I guess, preferred was asphalt emulsion at about a 6, maybe close to 10%. Depends if it's a semi or fully stabilized. So that was to me very detrimental. And then the other things like the new technologies such as Portland cement. Portland cement became disastrous for many of these communities that were used to mud plastering cyclically to maintain their chapels, their buildings, that they eventually started to collapse, abandoned. The influx of the younger generations into larger communities or larger towns such as Las Vegas, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and either and then also outside New Mexico. So many of these communities were left alone to deal with these types of issues. And that's when Cornerstones came about. And then Cornerstones really started to bring community together. So the community was, if there was no communities, we used to bring in volunteers as well. This actually started in 1986 under Churches Symbols of Community and eventually became Cornerstone's its own nonprofit. So you can see here the evolution. The other thing that is very, very important in many of these communities is the mayordomos or the caretakers, not just of the acequias, but also, and the acequias, what I mean by that are the irrigation ditches, which is throughout the Americas, the acequias was also somewhat Moorish. At least, acequia, the word is very Moorish. And then we also have the mayordomos that usually would take care of the churches. Could be one person, could be a man, could be a couple, could be a family. But we were missing that as well. So the structure of the community started to collapse and fail. But with the help of Cornerstones, we brought in the technical assistance and we were able to put a lot of the people in town, if there was still families involved, and really get them to get involved and then eventually restore these buildings that are a big part of the community. They're the anchoring portion when it comes to religion. And then we also were involved a lot in indigenous communities as well with their local housing and local traditions as well. So the last slide, I like to show this. This is a slide that I borrowed from a colleague of mine, Dr. Luis Fernando Guerrero in Mexico City. And then also to the right, this older indigenous woman from the Pueblo of Laguna. And the way that I see tradition or this earthen technology, being pushed into the next generations is teaching the younger generations. The knowledge of the elders really needs to be transmitted into the younger generations. The culture, the building, the value of it, and what it means when it comes to historical significance and their intangible and intangible cultural aspects. So with that, I will basically pass it on to Justina. Thank you all. Mhm.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Francisco. What a challenge to give us a brief overview and history of Adobe throughout the entire world. I know that there's a lot more that could be said about it. But for now, we're going to turn our attention to Georgia O'Keeffe's home in Abiquiu. Her home in Abiquiu is the second home that she purchased here in New Mexico. Her first home was also an Adobe home at Ghost Ranch. But a main difference is when she purchased the home at Ghost Ranch, it was more or less a turnkey property. It had been built in 1933 by the previous owner she purchased it from. And so it did not have the same extensive restoration that her home in Abiquiu did. This is one of my favorite O'Keeffe quotes. This is from an Architectural Digest interview that she did in 1981, reflecting back on her homes in New Mexico. And she said, "Building in adobe is like a disease. Once you start using it, you can't really ever stop." I think that's a wonderful quote because it speaks not only to the ongoing maintenance that is required to have an adobe home, but it also speaks to the addictive quality of working with mud for those of us that are very enthusiastic about adobe. So her home in Abiquiu, when she first saw the home, it was around the year 1934. She was traveling throughout northern New Mexico looking for new landscapes to paint. She was not able to purchase the home until 1945. And when she did, she more or less was purchasing an adobe ruin. The building that she purchased had origins dating all the way back to the 1700s. So we believe that the first few rooms of the property were built in the 1740s. Now, this is really common in northern New Mexico adobe architecture that a building starts with one room or a couple rooms, and then as the resident continues to live there, oftentimes a reflection of wealth that they're building, more rooms are added on. So not only are we thinking of this as a home that came out of the earth, a home made of mud, but this is a home that changed over time. And O'Keeffe herself described her Abiquiu home not as an architectural masterpiece, but a house that grew. And so, with those first few rooms in the 1700s, additional rooms were added on for approximately 100 years until about 1850. By 1850, the square footage of the home reached what we currently have today, which is 7,000 square feet. That includes the main hacienda as well as the carriage house that eventually became O'Keeffe's studio and bedroom. This is a floor plan, and I want to direct your attention over to the left side of the floor plan here because it really shows you how the room grew. And so on the left, that first image is showing the few rooms that existed pre-1800. And then between 1800 and really around 1850, we have these additional rooms being added on to the home. And in 1946, before the restoration starts, you can see the layout, and the carriage house had to be rebuilt entirely, completely reconstructed. Now, O'Keeffe purchases this home in 1945. The sale happens in December. Unfortunately, in the summer of 1946, her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, who is back in New York, falls ill, suffers a stroke, and eventually passes away. O'Keeffe travels to New York to be with him and then ends up spending her time in New York settling his estate for a few years. And as a result, she's not on site and in Abiquiu, and so she hires her friend Maria Chabot to oversee the design and the restoration of the property. So that restoration took place from 1946 until 1949. Now, what we end up with is the home and studio as you would see it if you were visiting us today. So it still maintains a lot of the vernacular New Mexican architecture, but there are ample modernist interventions. Maria Chabot was a really interesting individual, and as the co-designer of the home with O'Keeffe, deserves a lot of acknowledgement. So O'Keeffe and Chabot, they met at Los Luceros. Chabot ended up living with O'Keeffe at Ghost Ranch, and then eventually was appointed the general contractor of the Abiquiu house. Now, Chabot was bringing a really specific set of skills to the table. She had some background in construction, in general manual labor. She was fluent in Spanish, and I like to say that she walked into the situation with quite a bit of confidence. So what is incredibly lucky is that a lot of the decisions on the design and the construction took place through written correspondence between Chabot and O'Keeffe, while O'Keeffe was in New York and Chabot was in New Mexico. And lucky for us, we do have those correspondence published in a book, Maria Chabot, Georgia O'Keeffe Correspondence, 1941 to 1949, which was compiled by our former curator, Barbara Bueller-Lyons, and Ann Padden. And in these letters, Chabot writes, I had never found anything as romantic as this beat up building, a ruin, really. It took 6 months just to get the pigs out of the house. So it's important to note that when O'Keeffe is purchasing this property, it actually has been vacant for quite some time. A lot of local livestock had moved into the home. O'Keeffe mentions that when she first enters the patio, she's greeted by a large white pig. And so this really is a large undertaking to restore and, in many ways, reconstruct this home. A lot of the ceilings had collapsed, walls had caved in, but there was a very strong footprint, and the vernacular architectural features were very much still in place. So if you look on the left, this is a photo of O'Keeffe's front door when the property was first purchased. So you can see here that the walls have been disintegrating over time. So when this home was vacant, there was no one maintaining the exterior walls, and with rain and snow, eventually those walls do start to deteriorate, which led to the instability of the overall infrastructure of the home. Um, on the right, you see how the front entrance looks today. And what is wonderful is that O'Keeffe and Chabot do make the decision to maintain a lot of the original features where they can. So the door that you're looking at is the door that was installed in the 1800s. This large wooden door, it is split down the middle. So if you were visiting in the 1800s on horseback, the entire door would open. You would be able to lead your horse into the courtyard on the other side and visit the family that was living there. There's also a smaller cutout door, and that door, the portico, is for anyone who's visiting on foot. So if you were visiting O'Keeffe during her time at the home, this is where she most likely would have liked to greet you. It was a really grand entrance. It introduces the historicity of the property immediately. And of course, there are some really wonderful photos of O'Keeffe next to the door inside because beautiful sunlight is coming through the planks of the door, creating shadows and light, which we know Georgia O'Keeffe loved. So, luckily for Chabot and O'Keeffe, the Abiquiu community had many local laborers and artisans who were experts on adobe construction and had recently worked on the church that was in the community. And their willingness to participate in the reconstruction of the home, O'Keeffe said that she felt they were tired of looking at it falling apart as well. So she employed many of the local folks in the community, and we have lots of individuals in the community who will let us know that their grandparents, great-grandparents worked on this house. All of the materials were sourced locally, so all of the mud was coming from the area. Any wood material that was used was either being reused from the property, brought in from the Jemez Mountains. Everything truly was locally sourced. They ended up having to create 22,000 adobe bricks to reconstruct the home. And as Francisco showed earlier, this is a laborious process where this mixture of clay and sand is put into these brick forms and then laid out to dry. So you can imagine that making 22,000 bricks was quite time consuming. Now, her home not only was constructed from adobe, it also employed many different adobe treatments throughout the home, which we will get into. Here we are very lucky to have beautiful construction photos from Maria Chabot showing the individuals working on this house, creating the adobe bricks, having them laid out to dry, and looking at the way that they had to take down certain sections of walls to rebuild it. Now, the exterior of O'Keeffe's home was originally plastered in mud. And so here you can see there is a feathering pattern that's happening on the wall. This is a beautiful photo from Todd Webb that he took on one of his visits to her home. Traditionally, in northern New Mexico, the mud plastering was done by women. And so when O'Keeffe was having her walls plastered, women were coming to the home to do that. And they were using their hands or trowels to apply the mud to the wall. And one thing that's really special with adobe is you actually capture those gestural movements with the texture of the wall. And this is something that O'Keeffe became incredibly enamored with. Anecdotally, it is said that she loved the fact her home was made by the hands of women. Unfortunately, as we've already mentioned, adobe does require quite a bit of maintenance. So here is another photo of the patio. As you can see on the left, there's a lot of cracking happening. The walls are disintegrating a little bit. By the late 1950s, the walls were redone about 8 times. And not only was that an expensive endeavor, it meant that there was an ongoing presence of workers on the property trying to keep the adobe plastering looking good. So she very reluctantly but practically decides to have a cementitious stucco applied to the exterior of the walls. So when you are visiting the O'Keeffe Home and Studio in Abiquiu today, what you're seeing on the exterior is that cement stucco. Underneath, the walls are still made using adobes, and there is still plastering on the interior of the home, but anywhere on the exterior where the walls would be exposed to the elements, this stucco was applied. Now, we won't get into it today, but it's been well documented that O'Keeffe's fascination with this patio door was one of the primary reasons she purchased the home. And she did paint this door over 2 dozen times, often looking at the adobe wall around the door as well. After she applies the cementitious stucco, her interest in painting the patio more or less goes away. She does not like how this cement stucco looks, but it is practical and it is cost efficient. However, the entirety of the home is still adobe on the interior, and we have some really beautiful examples of different adobe treatments throughout the home. O'Keeffe and Chabot managed to really inject individual visual characteristics into each room. So each room really has its own vibe. Here we have this photo of the sitting room. This would have been a treatment that is referred to as poliata in Abiquiu. And so what happens is you have a packed mud floor, and then you're taking a mixture of earth, water, and flour, and you're combining it on a stove top for 30 to 45 minutes until it takes on this gravy-like consistency. Once that happens, a very thin layer is applied to the packed mud floor. So that layer is about 1/8 of an inch thick. It is incredibly, incredibly fragile. But in O'Keeffe's lifetime, she was walking in this space, her dogs were in this space, her guests were in this space, but it was nowhere near the number of visitors we have moving through the home today. So if you come visit us, you will be able to go inside of this sitting room, but you do have to stay on a pathway to help us maintain the floors. And as you can see, this treatment is not only on the floor, but it is on the bancos in the room, as well as on the walls. And even though we don't allow a lot of folks to walk through this space, we do still have to take on annual maintenance when we prepare for the new tour season. So here are some members of our team going through and preparing the floor for the new tour season. And as Francisco mentioned, it is so incredibly important that we continue to keep these traditions alive. Working in historic preservation is not only about preserving the building itself, but it also is about preserving the cultural heritage practices that are significant to the home. So having our team come and do this every single year is a very important part of historic preservation. You also get to see this beautiful gray adobe plaster in O'Keeffe's bedroom. This is a naturally pigmented adobe that is a result of some black dirt that she was sourcing from her friend Richard Prinslof's his ranch outside of Las Vegas, New Mexico. So she used this dirt. And so this is another consideration with historic preservation because this is not a commonly found material. And we do have to repair and maintain these walls as well. So we have to keep a large portion of dirt on the property so that it's available to us when we have to do repairs and routine maintenance. If you've been inside of O'Keeffe's studio, you have seen that there is wall-to-wall carpeting throughout the studio. This is something that was added later in life when she was starting to lose her vision. She needed high contrast flooring, and so that's how we end up with this gray beige carpeting that she ordered from Sears. However, underneath that carpeting is an adobe floor made from mud and linseed oil. Historically, this floor would have possibly been made with ox blood, and you add ox blood or linseed oil to the flooring because it takes on a polymerized quality that makes it more or less spill resistant, very easy to clean up, so perfect for a painting studio. We're very lucky because we have this closet in the studio, and the way the closet was built into the room, the floor was exposed. And so we're able to see that original flooring that is under the carpeting. The other beautiful thing about Adobe is that it allowed for a lot of experimentation for O'Keeffe. So here is a photo of the sitting room in 1964. This is before she's added that large picture window. But what I really want to draw your attention to is the Mies van der Rohe table that's in the middle of the room. So as you can see here, we don't have any permanent seating around the table with the exception of the banco. And then here's the same room in 1965, and you can see that these adobe mounds have been created around the Mies van der Rohe table to create what is permanent seating, but it's really only semi-permanent because later in the 60s, these are removed simply by adding water on top and disintegrating those seats. She replaces them with velvet floor cushions. Now, O'Keeffe not only engaged in earthen earthen architecture at her home in Abiquiu, but she was very interested in other architectural structures in the area. So we do have a few gems that I highly recommend visiting if you do come to Abiquiu. In the center of the Abiquiu community is the church Santo Tomas. That was originally designed by John Gamin, and many of the laborers who helped build that church went on to help with the restoration of O'Keeffe's home. We also have the Dar al-Islam Mosque, and that was designed by the Egyptian architect Hassan Fati. That is considered the largest adobe structure in the United States. O'Keeffe liked to visit Dar al-Islam. On that property is also her beloved Plaza Blanca, or the White Place, where she would often go hiking, camping, and painting. And we also have Christ in the Desert Monastery, which was designed by her friend George Nakashima. It is considered one of the tallest adobe buildings in the United States because of the steeple that Nakashima placed on top of the church chapel. O'Keeffe was good friends with Nakashima and often visited the site as the project was moving forward and was a big supporter of the monastery. So this is really just a glimpse into all things Adobe related to O'Keeffe. And on March 3rd, we'll be opening a new exhibition at the O'Keeffe Welcome Center in Abiquiu called A House That Grew. And we'll do a deeper dive into some of these topics. You'll have a chance to see some of these Adobe treatments in person, as well as some wonderful photography of the homes, both during construction and after construction. So the Welcome Center is open year round. We are open Tuesday through Sunday, and we are free to the general public. So if you are in the area after March 3rd, you can come by and see this exhibition. I also just wanted to quickly share some sources. So, first thing we have listed, it's the correspondence between Chabot and O'Keeffe that I mentioned earlier. I also highly recommend reading Georgia O'Keeffe and Her Houses by Barbara Bueller-Lyons and Agapita Lopez. We've also done some wonderful mornings with O'Keeffe on this topic and similar topics, so I invite you to check those out as well. You can find those on our YouTube channel or on the O'Keeffe blog called Insights. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Hey, great. Thank you, Justina. Thank you, Francisco. This has been such a pleasure. I've learned so much, and it's so valuable to be able to start with a conversation about the global history of earthen architecture before zooming into how that history is represented in O'Keeffe's home in Abiquiu. So thank you both so much, and thank you for being co-presenters today. Really appreciate your time. So we will go ahead and turn to our Q&A box. I do see some folks posing some questions. First, we have a question from Kathy. Kathy is wondering, Francisco, she wants to dive deeper into the history of Adobe, and she wonders if there's any courses that are offered online or on an auditing basis through the University of New Mexico Architecture and Planning School that you could recommend for someone who wants a really deep dive, or if not to that extent, maybe other books or other resources for folks who want to learn more.
Well, it depends. I mean, if we usually don't teach online courses, especially when it comes to architecture courses, but the course that I'm teaching this semester in the fall semester, which is called Alternative Materials in Construction, I do have a like a 5 hour lecture on world of Adobe architecture throughout the Americas and around the world, and we make Adobes, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're not able to do that, I would recommend a book by, I think it's called Earth Building, the Earth Building Around the World, something of that nature. And it's the author is Hugo Uben, and it's a French publication, but it's now in English and Spanish. It's Hugo Uben and Hubert Guillard, and they're good colleagues of mine. Hugo has passed on, but they actually have a really complete a book when it comes to earthen architecture, general earthen architecture, not just Adobe. Adobe is one specific type. So those would be my recommendations to you. But if you're able to join us at the School of Architecture and Planning in Albuquerque, you're welcome and to join our classes. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much. And we do send a follow-up email after these conversations, and we can include the title of that book for those who maybe didn't get a chance to write it down or who want to learn more. Let's see here. We have a question from Joan, also for Francisco, about the photo in your presentation at the very end where you had a child on the left and then the older person on the right. And Joan is wondering, so the bricks that the little boy or girl was making were so tiny. What's the story behind those little tiny versions of the Adobe?
Oh, so we usually make activities for kids where they're making like tiny little blocks, little adobes, and then they can actually build like structures with them. So it's part of like the education. Instead of making them like big, it's like making them small so that they understand the concept of them, and then they can actually build little houses. We did that at the Mayak Museum, or Museum of Indigenous Arts, I believe it's called, in Santa Fe at Museum Hill. We actually had about 300 kids, indigenous kids from the pueblos coming in. And we eventually ended up building like a little village, a little pueblo, yes, with like an oven, an horno, and it was really, really wonderful. So it's more of a tradition or of a way of teaching kids, the fun ways of building with earth, So keep it at a micro scale, not a macro scale. Mhm.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so great to know the what's going on in that photo. We have a question from Pamela, for either of you who have any recommendations for folks who visit New Mexico that may want to take tours that focus on adobe architecture. Or you've mentioned a few places, both of you, that are definitely worth seeing, but any sort of structured tour or any other activities that you would suggest to people who want to get a really good comprehensive view of these great buildings.
Wow. Well, one, I mean, of course, the Georgia O'Keeffe House, if you can go in there and then get in on time. But Justina mentioned the mosque. It's an amazing structure. I would debate with you, Justina, if it's actually the largest. To me, I think I come up the San Esteban del Rey Church is huge, and the walls are 8 feet thick when it comes to adobe. That's a lot of adobe there. So, but the other one is you mentioned it to the monastery, and if you want to go see archaeological sites, you have Pueblo Bonito. It's not adobe, but it's stone laid in mud mortar and then probably mud plaster afterwards. We have San Isidro, the museum in Corrales. Many, 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 I would say hundreds of churches in New Mexico and missions, or the San Miguel Mission in Santa Fe, the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe. There's so much. The Gutierrez Hubble House in the South Valley in Albuquerque, or the San Felipe de Neri as well. In Bernalillo, we have hundreds of them here as well. So they're basically everywhere. The Hacienda de los Martinez in Taos as well, which is another amazing double courtyard housing, which is now or house that's now an exhibit museum slash place that you can actually go visit. And they actually have their own nonprofit there. So much to see. Oh, the Pueblo of Taos as well, which is a World Heritage Site, as I presented to you in this presentation. So I don't know if you want to add anything to it, Justina. So
Sure. I just want to add, I'd like to mention Nuevo Mexico Profundo, which is a historic preservation nonprofit that works to raise funds for communities to restore the adobe churches in their communities. And it's a really, really incredible nonprofit. They do organized tours. So sometimes it'll be like a full day tour and you're going to multiple sites. So definitely check them out, get on their mailing list. The tours sell out really fast. Francisco mentioned like so many buildings, so I won't get into specific buildings, but we do have a lot of historic house museums here in New Mexico. And I really recommend going to Los Luceros if you haven't been there yet. O'Keeffe did stay there, but it's a beautiful historic site. So we're really lucky here in New Mexico to have so many incredible examples of earthen architecture.
yep. Mhm.
Great.
And if you want to get your hands dirty, contact Cornerstone's community partnerships. They'll put you to work, as a volunteer. So, and then, throw some mud up on the walls.
Great. Thank you so much. Wow. Such a vast number of amazing places to visit. We have a question from David. It's a bit of a technical question. So for either of you, he asks why the restoration, I'm assuming of the O'Keeffe House, avoided the use of asphalt emulsion to stabilize the adobe bricks. He understands it's a technique that started in the 30s, and is there a specific reason why that wasn't included in the plan?
You mean in the restoration of the house? Uh, Probably because he was so far away
Mhm.
from like the larger cities that people still continue to make the adobes in a traditional way. But with all the experimentation taking place, New Mexico, I would say, is probably the only one in the world that uses the asphalt emulsion to semi-stabilize the adobes, um, which to me they should never, never, never be used in any type of preservation, restoration, conservation project at all. because they don't allow the walls to breathe. It's like putting in a completely different material and trying to join it and bring it together with a traditional material, which is like putting concrete or putting cement to it. So that probably never really got to that point. But now, if you go to and buy adobes that are made in large factories or large sites, you will actually find them to be, I would say 99% of them will be semi-stabilized, which to me it's unfortunate. Mhm.
Mm.
So
Thank you.
if you're ever going to be doing a preservation project, you might have to do your own adobes. That's usually what I do.
Thank you for expanding on that. That's so interesting. Stepping back to the more global look at earthen architecture, we had a comment uh, asking or wondering about context that applies to how earthen architecture is represented in South Asia, and if you're able to comment on that a little bit to add to the global map that you presented at the beginning.
Well, one of the things, I mean, not well, in Asia, I would say that the Great Wall of China, for example, and a lot of people might think, oh no, it only exists in Yemen. No, it's all over the world, from Africa. The other thing is that they started to adapt it to their own climatic condition as well. And that always probably the best material on Earth, the best material to actually use in arid regions, but also in tropical rainy places such as the Wado and Dam that I was just showing you. It's also can be very detrimental in seismic zones, but can if you know how to build with it, and you can actually make it not seismic proof, but at least withstand an earthquake. But the other thing is that in China, the Great Wall of China, the amazing Great Wall of China, is made out of earth. The internal portions and the main structure is made out of adobe and rammed earth, believe it or not. So it's that's one of the major monuments in the world that is encased or veneered in stone, but the internal part of the construction, the structure, is earth, just like many buildings around the world.
Yes, and it just sounds like there's just so much to dive into if this is something that's of interest. This commenter was mentioning the rich architectural history in Bangladesh and Bengal, um,
Yes,
which sounds like another wonderful place to research.
everywhere, it's everywhere. So yes.
Fantastic. And let's see, another bit of a technical question from Steve, who wonders how long does it take for Adobe brick or Adobe to dry? Can you make them in the winter? Is it something that's a seasonal? What's some of the logistics behind actually creating?
There's also some wonderful sayings when it comes to adobe, at least here in New Mexico. It's like, there's a Spanish saying that says, un adobe sin paja es un adobe sin alma. An adobe without straw is an adobe with no soul. And remember, the straw was actually brought in by the Europeans. They did not exist in the indigenous world. But going back to your question, it depends on the climate, it depends on the weather, but I would say, at least in 2 3 days, just turn them over on edge once you create the first adobe, and then you can let them sit for a few 2 weeks at the most, and then you can stack them and allow them to sit for a while before you actually get to use them. So whenever you're going to be building a house or anything, um, at least have them drying for at least minimum of 1 month, 2 months. So yes, you would start never, 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 construct or build in the winter because they will freeze, and then because of the moisture, they will freeze and not work for you. So adobe making or tradition building should not be done in the winter. Mhm.
Fascinating. Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question. Another technical question. This commenter wonders, how does it work with the roof? How are roofs put on these Adobe? Maybe that's a
Ooh,
long question.
Well, no, really quickly, really quickly. So, like for example, the O'Keefe House had always had an earth roof. Not today, but that was like the traditional way or methodology of keeping water, from going into your house. So it was a higher clayish material, so that you could get water running off the spouts or off the scuppers or canales. Then later, when the Americans start to show up, now we have sawmills, and the sawmills really started to be applied onto a lot of these buildings. So that's why you see a lot of tiny, smaller vernacular houses in northern New Mexico that have pitched roofs because of the sawmills, and also because they started to bring in tin. And corrugated metal becomes essential for a lot of these communities where it snows a lot. So it's a transformation of typologies and materials in this vernacular architecture that we see, especially in northern New Mexico. And then, of course, in the 20th century, we start to see asphalt, built up roof, TPOs, PVC, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of like a quick evolution of like just about when it comes to the earth roofs that eventually get converted to a pitch roof, except for many houses that are still flat roof, like the Georgia O'Keeffe house. Mhm.
Wow. Thanks for the very, very quick primer on roofing. Much
No.
appreciated. So we are at 10:01, and I always like to close our conversations with just a comment from the chat. We hear from Lynn. This is not a question, but thank you for your wonderful presentation, and she's glad it's going to be archived for other people to watch. So thank you both again for your time, for all this wonderful information. And again, to those of you who are in the audience, we will send a follow-up email with some links with Justina's resources and some other information so you can take a deeper dive. But other than that, is there anything else that the two of you would like to share before we close out today?
No, but thank you for the invitation, Justina.
Yeah, thank you, Francisco, for joining us. And thank you for everyone who's interested in Adobe. I hope you'll continue to learn about Adobe. And yeah, lots of great resources I'm sure will be in that email.
Yes.
Yes, great. Yeah, so stay tuned for that, and we hope you can join us next month. But in the meantime, have a great rest of your day, and we so appreciate you joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.